It started with a headline that ricocheted across financial terminals. Trump slaps 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee. Brazil hits back at WTO. Reuters, August 1, 2025. Days later, the Wall Street Journal warned that the tax would cover over a third of Brazil's exports to the U.S., and coffee was front and center. Within hours, Arabica futures spiked to $288.67 a pound, reversing months of easing prices. From New York to Vancouver, cafe owners stared at invoices that had doubled overnight. Walmart and Costco shoppers blinked at new shelf prices that made their daily brew feel like a luxury. On one side of the equator, the U.S. framed it as economic leverage. On the other, Brazil called it political interference dressed as trade policy. The stakes are rising, the markets are jittery, and your morning cup is suddenly a geopolitical flashpoint. The question is, in this fight over beans and borders, who's really going to swallow the bitter cost? For decades, coffee was one of the quiet constants in U.S.-Brazil trade, a steady current beneath the surface of shifting political tides. In the golden years of the relationship, Brazil reliably supplied one-third of America's annual coffee consumption, roughly 8 million bags out of the 25 million the U.S. brewed through homes, offices, and cafes each year. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Brazilian farmers tapped into one of the most lucrative consumer markets in the world, while American importers, roasters, and retailers enjoyed a stable supply of high-quality Arabica beans at competitive prices. Even when political rhetoric flared over other trade disputes, from steel to ethanol, coffee remained largely untouched, treated as too culturally and economically ingrained to weaponize. But fissures began to form. The first signs emerged as Washington's trade posture hardened in the early 2020s, moving away from multilateral cooperation toward targeted tariffs. Brazil, meanwhile, diversified its export markets aggressively, deepening ties with China, whose share of Brazilian exports climbed to 28% by mid-2025. Tensions were further aggravated by non-trade disputes, including the Trump administration's demands for cooperation on the Bolsonaro legal cases, demands Brasilia rejected outright, citing sovereignty over its judicial process. These frictions coincided with global climate pressures that were already straining coffee yields, from droughts in Brazil's Minas Gerais region to erratic rains in Colombia. As 2025 unfolded, the perfect storm brewed. Washington saw leverage in targeting coffee tariffs to force concessions, while Brazil viewed such measures as an unacceptable intrusion, a calculated strike at a symbol of its agricultural pride and economic independence. The Trump administration's August 2025 decision to impose a 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee was not a spontaneous gesture. It was a culmination of months of calculated maneuvering. Officially, the White House framed the policy as a matter of trade fairness and national economic security, grouping it alongside a broader tariff package targeting specific Brazilian exports. While certain commodities like aircraft, orange juice, and some fuels were exempt, coffee was deliberately kept on the list. According to the Wall Street Journal, the tariff touched about 36% of Brazil's total exports to the U.S., with coffee singled out because of its market dominance. Brazil accounts for roughly 35 to 40% of the Arabica beans consumed in America. U.S. trade representative statements claimed the measure would encourage domestic sourcing and reduce dependency on politically unreliable partners, language echoing the administration's broader America First economic doctrine. Behind the scenes, however, the calculus was more political than purely economic. Administration insiders cited Brazil's refusal to cooperate on the Bolsonaro legal proceedings as a key irritant. While such issues were officially divorced from trade policy, the sequencing of diplomatic tensions, Brazil's public rebuke in July, followed by Washington's tariff announcement weeks later, suggested otherwise. The immediate market impact was dramatic. On the Intercontinental Exchange in New York, Arabica futures surged from an already elevated $4.41 per pound to nearly $4.90 per pound in the days after the tariff announcement, reversing a modest downtrend and igniting speculative trading. Importers scrambled to lock in contracts before the August 6th start date, creating a temporary buying frenzy that pushed prices even higher. For large-scale roasters like J.M. Smucker and Kraft Heinz, the tariff landed in the middle of annual procurement cycles, forcing abrupt revisions to cost projections. Both companies quietly informed major retail partners of incoming price adjustments, a move that rippled down to shelf tags at Walmart, Costco, and Kroger. Within a week, consumer watchdog groups documented price hikes of 15 to 20% for popular ground coffee brands, with premium single-origin products jumping by as much as 40%. The administration's public line was that American coffee drinkers would hardly notice the difference, asserting that alternative suppliers, Colombia, Vietnam, Ethiopia, could fill the gap. But industry analysts were quick to challenge this claim. Colombia's own harvests were down 9% year-over-year due to excessive rainfall, while Vietnam's Robusta production could not easily substitute for the Arabica blends favored in North America without significant changes to flavor profiles. Logistical constraints compounded the problem. Importers with established Brazilian supply chains faced multi-year contracts, equipment calibrated for specific bean sizes, and long-standing roasting recipes. Switching origin sources was neither instantaneous nor cost-free. In short, the U.S. move was less about creating immediate economic efficiency and more about signaling political resolve. It was a calculated risk, accept short-term pain in the form of higher prices and potential consumer backlash in the hope of extracting diplomatic concessions from Brazil and reinforcing a message to other trade partners that Washington was willing to weaponize even the most sacrosanct consumer goods. The gamble, however, carried an obvious question. If the morning coffee ritual is woven into the cultural and economic fabric of the U.S., just how far could policymakers push before that ritual became a rallying point for public discontent? For Canada, the U.S. decision to weaponize coffee tariffs against Brazil was not just an abstract geopolitical move. It landed right on its doorstep. While Canada does not produce coffee beans, its import, roasting, and distribution industry is tightly intertwined with both U.S. and global supply chains. Nearly 60% of the roasted coffee consumed in Canada originates from facilities in the United States, many of which rely heavily on Brazilian imports. When the U.S. tariff hit, those higher costs flowed north almost immediately, bypassing any illusion that Canada could remain insulated. Canadian roasters, particularly mid-sized companies in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, suddenly found themselves squeezed between skyrocketing import prices and consumer resistance to paying more for a cup of coffee. Some had contracts tied to U.S.-based distributors, meaning they had no choice but to absorb the inflated costs. Others tried to pivot toward direct imports from Brazil, hoping to sidestep U.S. tariffs, but quickly ran into a web of challenges, from longer shipping times through the Port of Vancouver to the need for recertifying quality control under Canadian regulations. The Canadian Coffee Association issued a rare public statement within days of the tariff taking effect, warning that retail coffee prices could rise by 15 to 25% over the next quarter. Our industry is highly dependent on predictable supply from Brazil, the statement read. This policy shift in Washington will have direct consequences for Canadian consumers and businesses, regardless of our own trade policies. The political response in Ottawa was cautious, but tinged with frustration. Prime Minister's office officials refrained from direct criticism of the U.S., instead emphasizing the importance of open and reliable trade flows and hinting at the possibility of invoking dispute resolution mechanisms under the USMCA if Canadian businesses faced undue harm. Trade Minister briefings made it clear that Canada was exploring expedited bilateral channels with Brazil to secure coffee supplies independently, though any such agreements would take months to materialize. For Canadian consumers, the change was felt most acutely in the country's cafe culture, from national chains like Tim Hortons and Second Cup to thousands of independent coffee houses. Some urban cafes began posting signs explaining price increases, directly blaming global trade tensions. In Vancouver's Commercial Drive neighborhood, a cafe owner told CBC that her wholesale prices for Brazilian beans had jumped 35% in 2 weeks, forcing her to raise the price of a standard latte by 50 cents. "We'll lose customers if this keeps up," she said, "but we'll lose the business entirely if we don't adjust." There was also a subtle but significant divergence in public sentiment between the US and Canada. While some American commentators framed the tariff as a bold move to assert economic sovereignty, many Canadians saw it as collateral damage from a neighbor's political theater. Canadian media coverage highlighted not just the economic costs, but also the perception that the tariff undermined the stability of North America trade, a cornerstone principle that Ottawa has defended fiercely in the face of past disputes over steel, aluminum, and dairy. For Canada, the challenge became twofold: cushioning its domestic market from immediate shocks while quietly working diplomatic back channels to prevent coffee from becoming the next long-term casualty of U.S. trade brinkmanship. The situation underscored a recurring reality in the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. When Washington makes an aggressive move against a third country, Ottawa often feels the splashback before it even has a chance to react. By late August 2025, the U.S.-Brazil coffee dispute had settled into an uneasy stalemate. Washington showed no sign of backing off the 50% tariff, framing it as a matter of principle and leverage. Brazil, in turn, doubled down, filing a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, rallying support from agricultural allies, and signaling it would not alter its judicial independence to appease U.S. demands. The two countries had locked themselves into positions where any retreat risked appearing as a loss of face. For Canada, the impasse meant no quick relief. Ottawa's attempts to negotiate direct coffee imports from Brazil faced logistical and contractual bottlenecks, while Canadian roasters remained caught in the inflationary wave triggered south of the border. Alternative sourcing from other coffee-producing nations could only partially offset the deficit, and often at higher costs. Meanwhile, global markets adapted in real time. Futures traders priced in the assumption that the standoff could drag well into 2026, keeping Arabica prices elevated. Retailers across North America began rethinking promotions, scaling back discount programs, and quietly testing smaller serving sizes to blunt the impact without alienating customers. The deadlock created a rare convergence of frustration. U.S. importers balked at political interference in commodity supply chains, Brazilian exporters bristled at punitive tariffs, and Canadian businesses fumed at being collateral damage. Yet despite the economic pain on all sides, neither Washington nor Brasilia appeared willing to budge, leaving the morning coffee ritual hostage to a geopolitical game with no easy exit. In the industrial outskirts of Toronto, Café Verde Imports had spent 2 decades building its reputation as one of Canada's premier specialty coffee roasters. Their signature blends relied heavily on high-altitude Arabica beans from Brazil's Minas Gerais region, beans prized for their smooth, chocolatey profile. Before August 2025, the company had maintained a stable supply chain, importing through a U.S. distributor in New Jersey and roasting in Ontario for cafes and grocery stores nationwide. That stability evaporated almost overnight when the U.S. tariff hit. Even though Café Verde wasn't importing directly into the United States for retail sale, their New Jersey partner suddenly faced a 50% surcharge on every shipment of Brazilian coffee, passing the cost directly to Canadian buyers. The price per pound jumped from $4.20 to nearly $6.50 within weeks, shredding the company's profit margins. Owner Lucas Mendes explored sourcing beans directly from Brazil to bypass U.S. routes, but quickly ran into logistical roadblocks. Canadian ports capable of handling refrigerated agricultural imports were already congested, and securing freight space meant paying premiums that erased any potential savings. Moreover, establishing new import licenses and quality certification processes with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency would take months. By September, Café Verde had no choice but to raise wholesale prices by 22%. Several longtime cafe clients reduced orders or switched to cheaper blends, some substituting Robusta beans from Vietnam. "It changes the whole flavor," Mendez told the Globe and Mail. "Our customers notice, and some won't come back." The pain rippled outward. In British Columbia, where independent cafes thrive on premium roasts, owners reported cutting staff hours to offset higher bean costs. National chains like Tim Hortons, with more diverse sourcing networks, absorbed some increases but still warned franchisees of potential price hikes in 2026. The tariff had effectively forced Canadian coffee culture into a defensive crouch, where even loyal customers were reconsidering how much they were willing to pay for quality. In the U.S., the blow was felt just as sharply, if less publicly acknowledged by policymakers. One telling example came from Morning Brew Co., a mid-sized roaster based in Minneapolis that supplied both local cafes and major retailers like Target. Before the tariff, 70% of their beans came from Brazil, sourced through long-term contracts that locked in volume and pricing. The 50% tariff obliterated those agreements overnight, pushing landed costs into territory the company had never faced. Within 2 weeks of the policy taking effect, Morning Brew's procurement team calculated that maintaining existing blends would require either absorbing an additional $1.2 million annually or passing it directly to consumers. Neither option was palatable. Switching to Colombian or Ethiopian suppliers offered only partial relief. Colombia's 2025 harvest was down nearly 10% due to weather-related disruptions, while Ethiopian shipments faced port delays and elevated insurance costs in the Red Sea corridor. The fallout extended beyond bean prices. Morning Brew had to redesign packaging to reflect new sourcing origins, retrain baristas and wholesale partners on flavor changes, and invest in marketing campaigns to reassure customers. Even so, sales volumes dipped 8% in the final quarter of 2025 as shoppers balked at $3.99 bags, jumping to $5.49 in a matter of weeks. For U.S. consumers, the tariff's impact was most visible at big box retailers. Walmart's store brand medium roast rose from $8.48 to $11.29 for a 2-pound bag, while Costco's Kirkland Signature Colombian Brazilian blend disappeared entirely from shelves, replaced by a more bitter, Robusta-heavy substitute. Coffee shop regulars faced similar sticker shock. A standard drip at popular chains crept past the $4 mark in many cities, prompting some to cut back or brew at home. The policy had been sold as a strategic move to strengthen domestic leverage, but in practice, it left American roasters scrambling, consumers paying more, and an entire segment of the retail economy recalibrating around a commodity that had suddenly become a luxury item. North America now finds itself in a peculiar bind. Two of its largest economies caught in a trade dispute with a coffee superpower, while the third, Canada, absorbs collateral damage it neither sought nor endorsed. Prices remain high, supply chains are stretched, and consumer habits are shifting in real time. What began as a targeted tariff has morphed into a shared economic strain that no one can fully control. As shelves are rearranged and morning routines rewritten, the question lingers: is this a temporary power play or the start of a fundamental reshaping of how the continent sources one of its most beloved commodities? Let us know your thoughts. Like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and subscribe for more.